Okay, this is the first of what I'm hoping to do for all of the homework exercises. This is where I'm going to be kind of walking through how I would create the model that fits the homework's proof. There are lots of different ways to do things. You don't have to do it the same way. I'm just trying to give people a glimpse into the way that I'm thinking about things, so that hopefully maybe that can change your thinking if you like the way that I'm doing things, or it can give you some inspiration to just maybe tweak your model a little bit. So let's make the islands system real quick. So this is going to be our islands homework. I just go ahead and got started. I have a go. I have a setup command. They don't currently do anything because I haven't actually given them any lists on what they do. So when we go into the procedures, this is how I would go about making these islands. And so this is going to be the system where we're just making the islands version. There's obviously going to be the lakes version. I would make something like a patches owned variable, and I'd have that be altitude. And when I am setting things up, I would first clear all. I'd reset ticks. And then I would go about producing the ways that I would make these islands show up. So when this is happening, the way that I would personally do it is I would tell all of the patches, when they get created, all of the patches have an altitude of 0 because they don't have, when I give it a patch zone variable, when a patch is generated, or when the patch is initialized, it doesn't fill that in unless I tell it what to do. So I'm going to tell that patch, hey, I haven't told you what altitude is, so you're just going to assume that altitude is 0 until a different number is given. So I want to select a few of those patches, and I want to pull them up, and then I want to try and pull everything else down. So what I would probably do is I'd probably start out by asking all patches. I'd have all of the patches in the system to set their altitude something probably random normally distributed. And since we're going to go all the way down to 200 or all the way down to 500, I'd probably have a mean of a random normal of 250 with maybe a really big range, something like 100 standard deviation. So what that's going to do is that's going to set up all the patches, and all the patches are going to have a color based on what we need to add color based on what their altitude is. So while I'm starting to make this, the way that I would initially do this is I'd add the color scheme in before I start creating these islands, because if I have to rely on like manually right-clicking on stuff and looking at and inspecting these patches, right? Here's an altitude of -95. Well, that's not super useful for me to have to do that every time. So when I want to set things up, the way that I would start setting this stuff up is I'd make sure to create some sort of visual for myself in the beginning. So all of these patches are going to eventually have a maximum altitude of 500 or 499 and a lower altitude of -500. So what I want them to do is I want them to color based on what the altitude is. So the way that I would do this is I'd ask the patches with an altitude over 0. I'd tell the patches with an altitude over 0, and just for simplicity's sake, I'll make that greater than as well. So now I'm selecting only my land patches. I haven't generated any land patches yet because everything is going to be below the sea right now. But when I am asking these patches, I'm going to ask these patches with an altitude over 0. I want to make sure that whatever I scale this to, I have them scaled to 499 as being the maximum. And so what I would want to do is I'd say set altitude. So I'm going to change these patches. If they have an altitude over 0 or over 499, I want them to bring it back down to 499. And if these patches, if the maximum altitude of all the patches is below 499, I need to scale that up. So I need to bring in, kind of pull or stretch down the this environment back to having a maximum altitude of 499. So I'm going to say, all right, all of the patches, set your altitude to be 499 times what your current altitude is, but I need to have something like a max altitude of patches, right? So if I'm asking a patch, right, the patch that I ask is the maximum altitude, so it's the highest altitude, so maybe it's an altitude of 300. That just happened to be the highest one in the way that I set this up. Well, this would be 300 divided by 300. So I would multiply 499 by 1, right? So that's what this is doing. The problem is every time I do this, I'm going to ask one patch to do this, and then I'm going to ask another random patch to do this. And while it's doing that, it could be giving different values for this max altitude of patches. So I don't want to let that kind of hang out right here. I need to replace this with a temporary variable. So I'm going to say let temp altitude be equal to the max altitude of all the patches, right? So now when I get to this point, that I'm scaling things up and down, the temp altitude is now going to be this, and it's stored forever. So before I start pulling and stretching my land patches back up, I'm going to remember what the maximum altitude was before I started stretching things. So this temp altitude is going to be the maximum at the beginning of this stretching. So I'm going to say temp altitude. And I'll call this temp max altitude just for simplicity's sake. So our temp max altitude is going to be this value. I'm going to do the same thing for my patches below the sea. And I'm just going to... Okay, so I've added in just another exact same version of this that is going to be looking at the pulling down my ocean altitude. So the minimum altitude of patches is going to be our temporary variable, and then we remember, hey, all of the patches that are in the ocean currently, let's bring you down to -500 based on what your current altitude is. So it's going to kind of stretch my ocean to take up that full range of 0 to -500. So that's how I would do it for the ocean. So now I've stretched everything. Now I need to have color as well. So when I'm trying to figure out what the color of these patches are, I want to color the land patches differently than I would color the ocean patches. So one way that you could do this is you could say ask patches with altitude over or equal to 0. So I'll ask these land patches with an altitude over to or equal to 0, and then I'll say, let's set your P color, because the P color is going to be our patch color, and I want these to be kind of in the middle of our browns colors. So I'm going to say the 50s are our brown colors. So I'm going to say 52, because if we go to 50 and 51, those are really, really dark. They almost look black, and it's kind of hard to distinguish them from the other colors. So we're going to say, all right, if your altitude is over 0, set your altitude to be this kind of darkish brown. But then I want those patches that are higher up to be slightly lighter. So I'm going to say set your P color 52, plus a range of 5. And just like how we scaled this up at this version of things, just like how we scaled this up, we're going to end up scaling this up. This 5, the lightest colors are going to be we're going to be multiplying this 5 by 1, right? So a really, really high altitude patch is going to be 52 plus 5. It'll end up with a color of 57. That's kind of a light whitish brown color. If we're multiplying this 5 by something like 0, right? If we're right at, if we're really far down below, then that altitude will be multiplying this by 5, so it'll be closer to this kind of dark brown. So the way that we could do this, we could say set altitude 5 times altitude divided by max altitude. And remember, we don't have to do our temporary thing like we did last time because we're not actually adjusting altitude at any point during this. So we can say this altitude divided by max altitude. So if this altitude is 499, this is 5, and then our P color is 57. If we're asking a patch that has an altitude of like 1, right, this is 1 divided by 499, almost, and so we were going to shrink this 5, it's going to be adding 0.08 or something like that. So this is the color is going to be 52.08, right? Pretty much brown. So when that happens, we need to add in one for our ocean as well. And I'm going to pause real quick. So I added in our ocean coloring. So now we're going to color the ocean based off of that as well. So now when we set things up, the only adjustments that we've actually done with altitude, the only adjustments that we've actually done to anything is we've had the patches create a mostly underwater value. So if we set this variable up, we'll see that almost everything is blue with some little dots of green, right? These are little tiny islands that have actually, just by random chance, a normal distribution is going to pull things that are over 0 in this case. If we use a mean of negative 250 with a standard deviation of 100, sometimes on the tail end of things we're going to have patches that are really high up. And because they've been just barely ticked over 0, that's going to be stretched and dragged by our previous thing, or our previous scaling efforts. So now I have mostly oceans, and I want to make this a little bit smoother, right? This is obviously like really jagged, right? You have a deep trench right here. You can't actually see my mouse because I've deleted it off the screen, but you have like really deep trenches standing right next to an island. That's obviously not realistic. So before we start stretching this a little bit, let's diffuse. And let's diffuse just a small percentage of our altitude. So something like 0.1. So 10% of the altitude, we're going to ask all the patches to diffuse. And it still kind of looks like a really jagged landscape, and that's because we've only shared a small portion of this. So what we want to do is we want to actually repeat this, and let's say we can repeat it 10 times. So now they're going to kind of smooth themselves out, and you can see that we have now deep areas of the ocean, and we have no land because they've actually pulled that the values that were above 0 kind of got diffused back down into the ocean. So now we have an ocean. There's deep parts of the ocean because we've scaled this up, so this is 488. And there's parts of the ocean that are fairly light, like something like a patch 37 here is only negative 130, right? So pretty close to the surface. So when we're doing this, I need to create islands too, right? So I'd want these patches to produce some islands. And a way that I would choose to go about doing this is I don't want to just tell one patch to be an island. I want that patch to be spread out a little bit, right? If I say ask patches, and I want to select a few, ask in of 2 patches, right? So I'm going to say 2 patches, set altitude, and we can say random normal. And let's go up to 250 and a standard deviation. So something like this. So if I'm going to say pull these 2 patches and bring them up above the ocean, when we see that, it's still not actually pulling this up. These are probably the 2 patches that I selected right here, but because I'm diffusing them back down into the water, right? So I'm kind of pulling them back down. So what I want to do is I not only want to ask these patches to bring that one patch all the way back up, but I would also want to ask a few of their neighbors to do that as well. So let's say we've asked these patches, we've selected 2 patches, and we've brought them back up out of the ocean. Right? We've created a an island with 250 as the mean and 50 as the standard deviation. So most of the time we'll pick 250 as a height. Sometimes we'll pick way above that. Sometimes we'll pick way below that. But let's ask our neighbors of these patches too. And we could say ask in of 2 neighbors. So we pick this island, and we've told this island to select 2 of the patches that are around it, 2 of the 9 patches that are directly touching it. And we can ask these patches to set their altitude to random normal 250, 50. So what does that look like? Now we're starting to actually see an island popping up out of the ocean, right? Here's our probably the highest mountain that we have, right? An altitude of 498, right? This is our one patch that actually managed to peek its way out. But now if we start repeating this and we ask more and more and more neighbors to get pulled up out of the ocean, in that case, our island is going to expand in size, and the diffuse, the melting of like bringing this altitude and sharing the altitude with the patches that are around it, since now we're sharing it with other land patches, we're not going to sink as deep down into the ocean. So I'm going to pause for a second, and I'm going to add a few more of these chains where we ask our neighbors to do this. Okay, so I've added in a few more of these chains, right? So we select 2 patches, and then we ask those 2 patches to find 4 of their neighbors in this case. And then we ask those 4 neighbors to find 4 of their neighbors and 4 of their neighbors and 4 of their neighbors, right? Spreading this island out. And in doing so, we can actually even shrink down our standard deviation, right? So we can shrink it down to like 150 so that the island, the periphery of the island may not be nearly as tall as the interior of the island. And if we do that, let's see what we get. We get things that kind of look like an island, right? Some parts of it are going to be relatively high, right? These kind of white portions of the island. And then there's going to be some portions of the island that are kind of on the periphery where they are kind of on the beachfront type thing. And if we kind of do this and set it up again, the one problem that I don't like about this is I don't like the fact that we have islands kind of being split across, right? This island right here up at the top right is the same as the island in the bottom left and the same as on the top right. That's all the same island. It's just kind of falling over the edge of the world, right? So I don't really like this kind of view. So what I want to do is I want to make sure that I'm only selecting patches towards the center. So let's show how we would do that, right? Instead of just asking 2 random patches, the way that I would go about doing this is I'd say, all right, I only want to ask potential patches that I would create these islands. Let's say let potential islands be let these potential islands be patches with x-core, px-core. X-core is what you would ask a turtle. Px-core is what you would ask a patch. To have a px-core smaller than 80% of the max px-core. So I'm only going to select patches that are close to the interior. And I don't want them to be too far to the left. I don't want them to be too small as well. And have a px-core that is greater than 0.8% or 0.8 of the min px-core. So when I do this, expected closing bracket. Oh, I wasn't multiplying. There you go. So now I've said these potential islands, I've created a list of all of the patches that have this px-core qualification satisfied. So I'm going to say, instead of asking 2 of patches, I can say, let all ask 2 of potential islands. Now, I'm not just asking any patches, maybe they're on the periphery. I'm only going to ask patches that are kind of here in the center on this x-coordinates. But if we do this enough, you see that I still have y coordinates that might be over. So let's add the y bits. So, and py core less than 0.80 times max py core, and py core greater than 0.8 times min py core. Right, so the exact same sort of thing that we did previously, and we can even clarify this a little bit. Right, so all of these have to be satisfied. We have to be selecting something that matches all of these traits. That's the only thing that we can say let potential islands be. You can actually even see this, right? If we cut this off and we say this is another command, and we say to blah, right? So we say that this is another thing. We can say ask potential islands set p color red. Did I spell that wrong? Oh, it doesn't like that. It's trying to remember what potential islands is, even though it's a temporary variable and it can't remember it across different procedures. So we say one of patches, just to get that satisfied. So when I do this, this is now that list of potential patches. And if I want to shrink this, right, if I want to make this set of potential patches be even smaller, I could do it something like this, right? I could say, I only want patches from 60%. So if I do that, you can see that the list of potential patches actually shrinks as well. So that's just to show you what our potential islands are. So now, when we remove all of that other junk that we just added in, we say let our potential islands be these patches here in the center, and then let's pick 2 of these potential islands. Now you can see that we're only going to be selecting patches that are from this center. And because this is a relatively small group of patches here in the very core, and we're making our islands fairly large, there's a good chance that we're actually going to meld them together. And that's okay. It's just an island, right? Sometimes there are islands that are kind of stretched out a little bit long ways. So that would be how I would go about selecting these values. And in doing so, you have some areas that are deeper in the ocean, and you have some areas that are more shallow in the ocean. And this would be how I would choose to do this. So that is a little primer on how I would go about working on this homework assignment.